Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story, The Town That Disappears at Midnight. It all began on a rainy Friday evening, the kind where the sky seemed to collapse under the weight of its own despair. I was sorting through old belongings in my late grandfather's attic, a chore I had postponed for far too long. Among dusty books, faded photographs, and peculiar trinkets, I found something that immediately piqued my curiosity: a leather-bound journal wrapped in a brittle, yellow map. The map wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It depicted a small, isolated town called Black Hollow, surrounded by dense forest and marked with an ominous warning scrawled in red ink: "Do not enter after dusk." Intrigued, I flipped through the journal, which was filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. It detailed his travels as a young man and, to my shock, several entries about Black Hollow. According to him, it was a place that didn't appear on any official records, a place he claimed could only be found by those it wanted to find. One entry stood out: "They call it the town that disappears at midnight. I've been there, though I dare not return. If you're reading this, heed my warning: some mysteries are better left unsolved." Despite the chilling warning, I couldn't shake the itch of curiosity. Who wouldn't want to unravel the mystery of a disappearing town? It felt like an adventure calling my name, a break from the monotony of my everyday life. The next day, armed with the map, a flashlight, and a backpack full of supplies, I set off on what I thought would be a harmless exploration. The map led me deep into a forest, a few hours away from my town. By late afternoon, the dense trees began to thin, revealing an eerie clearing where time seemed to stand still. There it was, Black Hollow. The town looked untouched by time. Quaint houses with wooden shutters lined cobblestone streets. A rusted playground creaked in the wind, and an old-fashioned clock tower loomed in the center of the square, its hands frowning at 11:59. As I wandered through the silent streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was unnaturally still, and despite the overcast sky, no shadows stretched across the ground. I decided to document my findings with my camera, but every picture I took came out blank, as if the town didn't want to be remembered. By evening, I noticed something even stranger. No matter which way I turned, every road out of town led me back to the clock tower. Panic began to set in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town seemed alive, subtly shifting, as if the buildings were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. At precisely 11:59 p.m., the clock tower began to chime. The sound wasn't melodious. It was a hollow, bone-chilling toll that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I frowned as the air grew colder and the shadows began to move. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. A woman, pale and gaunt, with eyes like empty voids. She pointed at me and whispered a single word: "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted toward what I thought was the forest, but the town didn't let me go so easily. The streets twisted and contorted like a labyrinth. As the final chime of midnight echoed through the air, the town began to vanish. Houses crumbled into dust, streets dissolved into nothingness, and the clock tower's frowning hands finally moved to 12. I stumbled into the forest, gasping for breath, as the town disappeared behind me. When I looked back, there was nothing but an empty clearing. I thought I had escaped, but I was wrong. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the clock chime again, but this time, it was coming from inside my house. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The chimes of Black Hollow's clock tower echoed in my ears long after I had escaped the town. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a lingering trick of fear, but when I glanced at the digital clock on my bedside table, the time blinked 12 a.m. The chimes rang again. They were faint, almost as if coming from a distance. but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I threw the blankets aside and searched my house. Every room was dark, yet each one felt suffocatingly small, like the walls were pressing inward. Finally, I reached the living room. My flashlight's beam danced across the furniture, and then I saw a clock. It wasn't mine. I didn't own a grandfather clock, yet there it stood, tall and ancient, its wooden frame engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to move when I looked too closely. Its hands were frowning at 11:59, the same as the clock tower in Black Hollow. As I approached, the clock began to tick. The sound was unnaturally loud, each second slicing through the silence like a blade. I reached out to touch it, half convinced I was dreaming, when the ticking stopped, and the room plunged into a suffocating quiet. Then, the clock struck midnight. The chime was deafening this time, reverberating through my chest. The room grew colder, and a sharp gust of wind extinguished my flashlight. In the darkness, I heard a faint whisper, like someone standing just behind me. "You shouldn't have left." I spun around, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, filling the room with incoherent murmurs. The flashlight flickered back on, and for a brief moment, I saw thin faces, down scenes of pale, hollow-eyed faces pressed against the walls, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, crashing into the clock. The room spun, and when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was back in Black Hollow. The town was darker this time, shrouded in a mist that clung to my skin like cold sweat. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its faint ticking echoing through the empty streets. I tried to retrace my steps, hoping to find the clearing and escape again, but the roads had changed. Every turn led me deeper into the heart of the town. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision, darting behind buildings and slipping into alleyways. My breath came in ragged gasps as I realized I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the fogman dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and eyes sunken. He didn't speak, but he raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the clock tower. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. That's when I noticed the others. More figures emerged from the shadows, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. They were coming from every direction, closing in slowly, their whispers growing louder. "The clock, the clock, the clock." The words blended into a chilling chant. Panic surged through me as I ran toward the clock tower, the only place that seemed to hold any answers. The doors were ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed them open and stepped inside. The interior was as unsettling as the rest of the town, dusty, decayed, and reeking of damp wood. The gears of the clock were exposed, massive and intricate, ticking with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. As I climbed the spiraling staircase to the top, the chanting faded, replaced by a deafening silence. At the top, I found a small room with a single window overlooking the town. A figure stood by the clock face, her back turned to me. It was the woman from before, the one who had warned me to leave. Her voice was soft but firm when she finally spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." "I didn't mean to," I shouted. "I didn't have a choice." She turned to face me, her hollow eyes piercing into mine. "No one leaves Black Hollow unmarked. You've brought it with you, and now it's part of you." "What does that mean?" I asked, trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the gears. They were slowing down, grinding to a halt as the hands of the clock tower frowned once more at 11:59. "Fix it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "or it will consume you." Before I could ask how, the room darkened, and I felt myself falling. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my house, sprawled on the living room floor. The clock was gone, but the ticking remained soft, persistent, and inescapable. When I woke up, The ticking was still, there soft, distant, but constant. I sat up, clutching my head, and scanned the room. My living room was exactly as it should be. No mysterious clock, no strange whispers, no hollow-eyed faces, but the weight of Black Hollow lingered in the air, an invisible presence pressing down on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was over, that it had all been some bizarre nightmare, but as the day unfolded, the signs were impossible to ignore. It started small. I noticed my reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It would lag, just slightly a blink, a turn of the head, a faint smile that didn't belong to me. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but by noon, it became undeniable. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying myself. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, my reflection raised its hand before I did, pressing it flat against the glass. My real hand stayed frowning at my side. "It's part of you now," my reflection whispered, lips moving out of sync with my own. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the reflection returned to normal. But the message was clear: whatever had happened in Black Hollow had followed me. By evening, the ticking grew louder. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It came from everywhere: the walls, the floor, even the air itself. I couldn't escape it, no matter where I went. I tried drowning it out with music, with television, with anything, but the sound always crept through, louder and more insistent. That's when I noticed the second mark. A small, red sigil had appeared on my wrist, faint but unmistakable. It looked like the swirling patterns I'd seen engraved on the clock in Black Hollow. When I touched it, my skin burned as if seared by an invisible flame. The final mark came at midnight. I was sitting in my living room, clutching the journal I'd found in my grandfather's attic, trying to make sense of everything. The journal was my only link to Black Hollow, my only hope of understanding what was happening to me. As the clock struck midnight, the pages of the journal began to flip on their own. The words rearranged themselves, forming a new entry I hadn't seen before. 3 marks bind you to the hollow. To break free, you must turn the clock, but beware, the cost is steep, and the watchers will not let you go easily. The chimes echoed again, but this time they weren't distant. They were coming from the attic. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay where I was, to burn the journal, to forget this nightmare entirely. But the ticking grew louder, each second like a drumbeat urging me upward. The attic was cold, far colder than it should have been. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, like blood. In the center of the room, where I'd first found the journal and map, stood a clock, a smaller, yet identical version of the one in Black Hollow. Its hands were frowning at 11:59. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the frigid air. As I reached out, the sigil on my wrist flared with pain, and a voice whispered from the shadows, "Turn it back." I spun around, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting like living things. Then they emerged, figures draped in darkness, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The watchers. They moved slowly, their feet never touching the ground, their whispers filling the room. "It's too late. You're ours now. The clock belongs to the hollow." I ignored them, focusing on the clock. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I had no choice now. The journal's cryptic warning burned in my thoughts. Turned the clock. I gripped the clock's hands, their cold metal biting into my skin. The watchers surged closer, their whispers growing into a deafening roar. My wrists burned as I forced the minute hand backward, each movement sending a shock of pain through my body. The moment the clock struck 11:58, everything changed. The attic dissolved, replaced by the fog-drenched streets of Black Hollow. The watchers were gone, but their whispers lingered. The sigil on my wrist pulsed with light, growing brighter with every passing second. Ahead of me, the clock tower loomed, its frowning hands mocking me. I realized then what I had to do. The journal hadn't just been a warning, it was a guide to break the marks, to sever my connection to Black Hollow. I would have to climb the clock tower again and turn back the town's time. But the town wasn't going to let me go without a fight. The shadows began to move, twisting into monstrous forms that crawled toward me on unnaturally long limbs. Their hollow eyes gleamed with malice as they whispered my name. I ran. The streets of Black Hollow weren't just empty, they were alive. The cobblestones twisted beneath my feet, leading me in directions I hadn't chosen. The buildings loomed larger, their windows like unblinking eyes. The town itself seemed determined to trap me. I sprinted toward the clock tower, clutching that journal tightly. The sigil on my wrist burned brighter with every step, pulsing in rhythm with the ticking that surrounded me. The monstrous forms in the shadows slithered closer, their whispers growing louder and more coherent. "You don't belong here. You can't escape. Turn back, and we'll let you live." But I knew it was a lie. The Watchers, the town, they had no intention of letting me go, not unless I did what the journal demanded. I threw open the heavy wooden doors of the clock tower and stumbled inside. That air was colder here, thick with a sense of dread that seeped into my bones. The massive gears groaned as they turned, the sound echoing like a heartbeat through the tower's hollow interior. The staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. I took a deep breath and began to climb, the weight of the journal growing heavier with each step. Behind me, the door slammed shut, and the whispering voices crept closer. Halfway up, the steps began to shift beneath my feet. They stretched and contracted like sinew, making the climb treacherous. The journal slipped from my grasp, tumbling down into the darkness. "Leave it!" a voice hissed, slithering out of the shadows. I hesitated for a split second before continuing upward. The journal had already told me what I needed to know. At the top of the tower, I found the clock's massive face, its hands still frowning at 11:59. Behind it, a complex mechanism of gears, levers, and chains ticked slowly, as though the clock itself was alive. The Watchers were waiting. Their forms filled the room, shifting and writhing like shadows made flesh. They didn't attack, but stood in silent anticipation, their hollow eyes locked onto me. "You can't stop it," one of them whispered. "It's too late," said another. I ignored them, focusing on the gears. I remembered the journal's instructions: turn the clock, but beware, the cost is steep. There was a lever at the center of the mechanism, rusted and ancient, as if it hadn't been touched in centuries. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the sigil on my wrist flaring with pain. As I pulled the lever, the clock's mechanism groaned to life. The hands of the clock began to move, ticking backward. Each tick sent a wave of agony through my body, as though the town itself was trying to rip me apart. The Watchers screamed, their forms distorting as the clock unwound. The shadows around them fractured, revealing face-down scenes, maybe hundreds of trapped souls who had fallen victim to Black Hollow. Their eyes were pleading, their mouths forming silent cries for help. The sigil on my wrist burned brighter, searing into my skin. I realized with growing horror that the cost of turning back the clock wasn't just physical pain, it was a piece of myself. As the clock struck 11:58, the tower began to shake. The gears ground against one another, sparks flying as the mechanism threatened to collapse. The Watchers screamed louder, their forms breaking apart into ash that swirled around me. And then I saw her. The woman who had warned me before stood at the edge of the room, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "You're breaking the cycle," she said, her voice a blend of relief and sorrow. "But the hollow never truly lets go." "What does that mean?" I shouted over the cacophony. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You'll understand soon enough." With that, she raised her hand and pressed it to my chest. A blinding light erupted, and I felt myself being torn from the tower, from the town, from the very fabric of Black Hollow. I woke up in my living room, sprawled on the floor. The clock was gone. The ticking silenced. The sigil on my wrist had faded, leaving behind a faint scar. For a moment, I thought it was over. But when I looked at the journal, I saw a new entry. The hollow is a parasite. You turn back time, but the marks remain. It will return, and when it does, it won't let you leave again. The days following my return to the real world were uneasy. I told myself that it was over, that I had turned back the clock and severed the hollow's grip on me. But the journal's final warning echoed in my thoughts. It will return, and when it does, it won't let you leave again. For a week, nothing happened. The sigil on my wrist had faded into a faint scar. The ticking was gone, and the nightmares of Black Hollow stayed away. I almost convinced myself it was truly over until the clock appeared again. It was midnight when I heard it, the familiar, hollow chime echoing through the house. My heart sank as I sat up in bed, sweat dripping down my face. The sound wasn't distant this time. It was louder, closer. I followed the noise to the living room, and there it was, a grandfather clock identical to the one I had seen in Black Hollow. Its hands were frowning at 11:59, the sigil engraved into its wood faintly glowing. "You've ignored us long enough," a voice whispered from the shadows. I turned sharply, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to stretch and warp, the walls bending inward as if the house itself was folding in on me. The journal, which had been sitting untouched on the coffee table, flipped open on its own. A single sentence scrawled itself across the page in blood-red ink. "The hollow has claimed you. Run, but it will always find you." The chime rang again, and the sigil on my wrist flared back to life, glowing so brightly it illuminated the entire room. My body was frowning in places. Shadows began to pour out of the clock, twisting into the monstrous forms I had encountered before. "You turned back the clock," one of the figures hissed, "but you cannot undo the mark." "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadows moved closer, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. One of them extended a long, skeletal hand and pointed to the clock. "Time belongs to the hollow. You stole it. Now, it's time to pay." I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, its halls twisting into a labyrinth that mirrored the streets of Black Hollow. Every door I opened led me back to the same room, where the clock's frowning hands mocked me. The journal's cryptic message burned in my thoughts. "Run, but it will always find you, no matter where I went." The hollow's grip was inescapable. Finally, I stopped. I couldn't run anymore. My chest burned, and my legs felt like lead. I stood before the clock, trembling as the shadows surrounded me. "What happens if I let it take me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The shadows paused, their whispers softening. One of them stepped forward, its form shifting until it resembled the woman from the clock tower. "You become part of it," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "A watcher, bound to the hollow for eternity. And if I fight?" Her hollow eyes met mine. "Then you risk more than your soul." The sigil on my wrist burned hotter, searing into my skin like molten metal. The clock's hands began to move, ticking backward once again. With every tick, the world around me fractured, splitting into shards of darkness and light. I had to make a choice: surrender to the hollow or find a way to destroy it. In a desperate act, I reached for the clock. The watchers lunged toward me, their screams deafening, but I ignored them. My hands gripped the clock's ends, forcing them forward. Past midnight, the moment the clock struck 12:01, the world exploded in light. The shadows screamed, dissolving into ash. The clock shattered, its gears flying in every direction. When I woke, I was lying in the clearing where Black Hollow had once stood. The town was gone. No clock tower, no cobblestone streets, no twisted shadows, just an empty field bathed in sunlight. The scar on my wrist was still there, but the sigil had disappeared. The journal lay next to me, its pages blank. I don't know if I truly escaped the hollow, or if it's just biding its time, waiting for another opportunity to claim me. All I know is that the ticking is gone, and for now, I'm free. But every night at midnight, I still hold my breath, waiting for the chime. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.